USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Week in Review podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. A look at this weekend in college hockey and a review of the top news of the week.
Welcome to the Weekend Review podcast from USCHO.com for Monday, January 6, 2020. I'm Ed Trefzger, joined this episode by Dan Rubin. The 2020 NCAA Frozen Four is our sponsor. It's coming up April 9th and 11th in Detroit. For tickets, visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. Well, Dan, we like to start with the Fortress Invitational because it was our game of the week. And that's why you're here joining us, because Jim Conley, who was on assignment out there to cover that, is sitting somewhere glumly in an airport watching a news channel and waiting for an update on his flight and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't know that for certain. I'm just guessing based on recent airport travel that I've done. But it was a pretty good tournament. Cornell and Providence in the championship, a 2-2 overtime tie. The Friars win it in a shootout. It was Jack Dugan. Dugan has 37 points on the season. That one doesn't count toward that, but a win there. Ohio State took overtime to down Army. So a pretty good tournament. When you get overtime games in tournaments, it's awesome.
Yeah, and I think the fact that you had such a high level of competition too. I mean, sometimes you get a team that loses that first game and they just have a hard time coming out in the second game. That didn't happen with Ohio State. The game against Cornell, the 5-2 game, I think was not what I thought was going to happen with Ohio State for sure. But the game got away from them down the 4-0 to the third, or in the third period, and they came out and they were rip roaring ready to go against the Army. The difference being was that so was Army, and I think that's a good showing there for our guys, as we like to say in Atlantic hockey. They came out and took them to overtime, really hard fought game, and it led into a championship game that I think really made that tournament worthwhile. That Providence Cornell game was fantastic, and anytime you can get a shootout, that's the way the game has gone. I think it's exciting for the fans that were in attendance. I know there were some, even though people obviously traveled out to the game. When you're out in Vegas, it's a new hockey market that isn't used to games ending in ties. They're used to the games going to shootouts and that nature. So I think it's a good tournament, and I think it was befitting of being able to be played on the Strip in fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. Yeah,
attendance around 5,000. Army's coach Brian Riley said that it had the feel of an NCAA regional, and any regional that got 5,000 in attendance, I know the NCAA would be happy, and maybe a bid for a Frozen Four down the road out there. A couple of players want to mention Jack Dugan. He's one of the freshman there from Providence, is one of the guys being mentioned in the Hobie Baker conversation. Another player who fed into things this weekend who's being mentioned, Tanner Lasinski, got the game-tying goal against Army to send that into overtime for Ohio State in the consolation game. And speaking of Army, Trevin Kozlowski gave up 3 goals against Providence, 2 against Ohio State, but he was a huge part of keeping Army solid in those games.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly what Army's needed. That was the missing link coming into this year, was goaltending, and now they have it. And Trevin Kozlowski, who dealt with I believe some injury last year and didn't play more than maybe a dozen or so games. He's the guy that I know they were hoping was going to clamp down, and won the battle and took to it. The one other thing that I want to mention while we're on there was for Providence College, Jack Dugan, not sure if you mentioned it, but I think he was actually drafted by the Golden Knights too. So hopefully he got a taste of his future career out there in Vegas, where playing in that arena and on the Strip and all the fun that goes along with playing in that hockey market.
You got to hope maybe he brought a few fans through the doors. But yeah, you're right about Kozlowski. He was injured last year, and his coach, Brian Riley, said he made a mistake bringing him back a little too early. So it's been a great season for him. Let's move on to another interesting matchup that was home and home with a day in between. Friday, Western Michigan at Notre Dame, and Notre Dame at Western Michigan on Sunday, a 1-1 overtime tie on Friday, and a 4-1 win for Notre Dame on the road on Sunday. What really stands out to me on this, Cale Morris, great weekend, 40 saves on Sunday, 42 saves on Friday in the tie. And then Cam Morrison, 2 goals, 2 assists on the weekend for Notre Dame. He got the goal in the overtime tie on Friday, a goal and 2 assists on Sunday. Western Michigan has been plagued by injuries, and to put up a shot advantage of 43-33 and 41-27 shows that the Broncos have got a little firepower. They just could not solve Cale Morris. And really a tough spot for Western Michigan right now, having had difficulty in the first half of the year, being so depleted at times.
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time looking at Western Michigan and seeing a team that's under 500, that's not really that's teetering, especially when you're coming out of that conference and you're an under 500 team. It drops you down to those spots that I don't think a lot of the NCHC teams belong. And by that, I mean down outside of the top 25 of the PairWise rankings. I think they're a lot better of a team than that. And you go back to that stretch in November when they ripped off, I think it was 5 or 6 games without a loss and played really well. I know they beat Michigan. They were beating Ferris State. They took a win in Denver. It's really unfortunate that since then they've struggled. And for Notre Dame, it's a big win. They caught Western Michigan at the right time coming out of a break, and coming out of their break at Notre Dame to start the 2020 portion of the schedule, and got a hot goaltender who was well rested in Cale Morris and turned the tide back, because those were 2 teams that heading into that weekend I felt were kind of on a similar trajectory. They were meeting at a crossroads for each other. And I figured it would have made for a really fun, exciting weekend of hockey. I think the unfortunate thing that definitely happened on Friday, but with Notre Dame on Sunday picking up the 4 goals and going up 4-0, that was not what I was going to expect. But it's unfortunate right now for the Broncos, because I think they're a lot better than a 7-8-3 overall record.
And Notre Dame, they had that slump, the 6 in a row in the loss column, leading in to a win right before the semester break. But they're going to need strong performances from both the guys I mentioned. Cale Morris needs to be rock solid in goal. And an offensive spark from Cam Morrison on a team that is also looking to score by committee is also pretty important.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that I think about Notre Dame. They've always been able to stay fluid to what they need to have happen. And so if they need to spread it out, they'll spread it out on offense. If they need to clamp down and play more of a defensive style, they've always been really fluid to what they need to do. And I think the losing streak that they had down the stretch of 2019 maybe woke them up to take the 2-3 weeks in between and fix and tinker and come out. I admittedly didn't watch the games, but anytime you have strong goaltending and timely scoring, I think it's indicative of playing to your style the right way. And like you said, with the scoring by committee and finding a guy who can maybe light the lamp a little bit more and maybe jump to the top of the score sheet, which is where Cam Morrison is right now.
Let's turn to the Desert Southwest, Arizona State and Michigan Tech. And I'm sure Tech didn't mind coming from the Upper Peninsula down to Arizona State for the weekend. A 3-2 Michigan Tech win on Sunday after a 4-3 win by Arizona State on Saturday. If you look at the box score, every single stat, every single number on there is almost identical between the teams in both games. And that kind of ties into what Jim Connolly and I have been talking about, how Arizona State is a good, maybe a very good team, but not yet an elite team, even in the PairWise. And we'll get into the PairWise a little bit more. Michigan Tech now after the weekend at 15, Arizona State at 16, 2 pretty evenly matched teams. But the difficulty on all of this is Arizona State has one route into the NCAA tournament, which will be its only postseason tournament, being an independent school. They have only one way in, and they really are at a point where they need to be sweeping some home weekends and getting 3 or 4 points on the road to stay in there. They're going to be facing a few Atlantic teams that are not going to help them in the PairWise, even if they win the weekends. It's not going to be that much of a bump. They've got to take care of business. This is looking, I don't want to say dire, but dangerous right now for Arizona State.
Yeah, I think this was something I know I talked about with you. I think it was last week or the week before, but I talked about Arizona State's second half, and it just, I don't like the schedule for them. I know that as an independent, you kind of have to play the hand that's dealt to you. And if you are playing a weaker schedule, and by weaker, proof is in the pudding, no matter how much I try to espouse the virtues of Atlantic hockey, if you're playing a weaker schedule, you simply can't lose. So you have to win key games and avoid losing the other games. So I think beating the teams that are underneath them, and this is kind of how the PairWise has turned out. And if you're new to college hockey with the PairWise rankings, or you're an Arizona State fan who understood what happened last year when you won 20 games and got in, it's a little bit different, which is that if you lose to a team that's underneath you, you tumble down the rankings. And if you beat teams that are underneath you, you don't necessarily gain ground unless you're getting help in front of you. Splitting with Michigan Tech, similar to only tying Harvard, really hurts for Arizona State, because they're a team that needs to jump up. They need to beat those teams that are next to them or in front of them, or they're going to wind up stuck at 16, 17. Now, here comes the problem over the next month. 2 games at Brown coming up next weekend. As much as I love my Bears up here in Providence, I know that they are not a top 15 team by any stretch. RIT, same idea. You're getting Robert Morris. You're getting a game against Holy Cross and Bentley. Even the games against Anchorage that you're playing at home around Valentine's Day, you just can't lose those games now. And you have to hope for a little bit of help along the way, which is you have to essentially win out. Not saying that's the truth, but that is kind of what you're looking at. If you split with Clarkson, if you split with Wisconsin, you're running into problems, because Wisconsin's down at 33. Clarkson's your best bet, because they're at 13. So you have to sweep essentially everybody the rest of the way, run the table, and still get help, because you're not going to get much help if you lose any of those games. And there's some tough road trips in there. I can't think that leaving Arizona to go to Clarkson is going to be an easy trip, because it's a remote part of the North Country. Coming up to Boston, I know that it's a direct flight to come to Holy Cross and Bentley, but it's still a long travel. And this is where some of that later in the season, coming off of a home weekend, coming off of some consecutive games, starts building issues into Arizona State this year.
Yeah, you're right about the travel up to Clarkson. They're probably going to have to go from Phoenix to Chicago or Atlanta, and then hop to Syracuse, and then bus up to Potsdam for a couple hours. That's not really that fun a trip. So you're right. You're right on all accounts there. We're going to talk a little bit more about the PairWise towards the end of the podcast, but Arizona State needs to be somewhere like 13 or above at the end of the season in the PairWise to make the tournament, because there are going to be 1 or 2 or possibly 3 of the positions taken by auto bids by teams that would not be in the top 16, which pushes that Mendoza line up to about 13 or 14. So we'll definitely look at that at the end of the podcast. Right now, we're going to take a quick pause. Our sponsor is the 2020 NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th in Detroit.
This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from US College Hockey Online.
Every time you show up, every time you make your presence heard, whether you clap your hands or stomp your feet, lead the chant or join the chorus. However you choose to be a fan, you make the game. The NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th at Little Caesars Arena in Detroit. Visit ncaa.com/Frozen4 to get your tickets today.
Continuing with the Weekend Review podcast for January 6, 2020, UMass had a big series out at Denver. Denver came from behind both nights to win. A pretty good matchup there. And again, like we talked about with Arizona State and Michigan Tech, 2 teams that are very close together, but 2 teams that you can put into the elite or nearly elite class in Division I.
Yeah, I've been saying about UMass, one of the things about them is that this year I always felt like they didn't necessarily have the same it factor that they had last year. And again, that's not meant to say that they're not an elite team. but it's the difference between being ranked 6th or 7th in the country or 5th in the country versus being 1st or 2nd in the country in the North Dakota Cornell class right now. UMass played really well out at Denver. Those games, those were good games. And Denver is a very good annual team that's going to win a lot of games. So anytime you can play those teams tight and play well out there, it's a positive. Now, that said, the second game is going to hurt UMass somewhere along the line, which when it comes to seeding or something along those lines, I don't think it's going to be one of those great, issues where they keeps them out of a tournament. That's not going to happen. But they were up 2-0 and then they fell and they lost and they were down 4-2, managed to score to make it 4-3 before the end of the second period. And that one hurts a little. I mean, it was still a very good game against a very good opponent, and coming out of some of the games that they've had where they've been playing Brown, they've been playing RPI, they played Maine, stepping up in competition, it's a good test for them. I think it's a really good way to get their wheels moving into this weekend against Boston College, which is going to be a fantastic weekend of hockey. But kudos to them for playing a good team well. And for Denver, hey, you took care of business against a team that I know they saw them in the Frozen Four last year. But for Denver, those are the games that Denver's come to know and expect to win, just like when they beat BC earlier this year. So for Denver, the train just kept on moving. Now I think they've won like 4 in a row, 5 in a row. And I don't think that it's kind of funny when you look at a team and say, well, they're 13-3 and the train just keeps moving. They just swept another weekend.
Well, speaking of Denver, their NCHC rival North Dakota put together a couple of good marks. First of all, they've won 11 in a row, have the Fighting Hawks. But now they have just, with the game, the weekend sweep over Alabama Huntsville in the game Saturday night, they've now won 13 in a row at Ralph Engelstad Arena, which is a record for that newer arena for North Dakota. They are a terrific team, and I was just thinking about it. Our friends at the NCAA help sponsoring our podcast. North Dakota, if North Dakota is in the Frozen Four, attendance is not an issue. Buffalo would have been sold out had North Dakota been in there. It's no problem for people to hop in the car or the SUV or the pickup truck to drive from Grand Forks to Michigan or to Buffalo. So this looks good for attendance and certainly looking good for North Dakota for some Frozen Four chances. I'm just amazed at how terrific North Dakota is. I expected them to be better. They are indeed the number one team.
Yeah, which was kind of funny that Alabama Huntsville scored 30 seconds into the game in the first game out at the Ralph, and then that ended quick. But Jordan Kawaguchi, a couple of goals, Jordan Mismash, another couple of goals. I mean, this team's they're good. They're so good. They're incredible. Life is more fun when you have your traditional dynasty type teams that are playing really well. Life is more fun when North Dakota is good because it gives you, it's like when the Yankees are good in baseball or, one of those teams, because it gives you, you're like, all right, they're back. And when they're in it, if you're from the East, you see a Cornell, North Dakota potential matchup, and that's tantalizing you because you think of the old Eastern team against the old Western team, or a Boston College, North Dakota matchup. I think that'd be a lot of fun. And you know what? That's such a tough place to play out there at the Ralph. It's incredible. And they've won so many games out there. And if you're heading out there, that's good for a goal or two for the Hawks. So, they keep rolling, and Omaha is coming up this weekend. There's no shame in what they've been doing to teams. They keep on trucking, because until you get to the national tournament and run into an Atlantic hockey team, they're the number one team in the country.
I would not want to be playing them in the NCAA tournament, no matter what league I'm in, and no matter where I'm ranked. Quinnipiac, they have been a team on our radar as an underachiever so far this season. What a terrific weekend they had, a 6-1 win over Harvard and a 5-1 win over Dartmouth, and getting some love in the USCHO.com poll from the voters for that. This is probably a better Quinnipiac team than its record says, and maybe this was more indicative of how good they are.
Yeah, I think so. Quinnipiac, is one of those teams where I always say they're a product. They have some great athletes there. They have some great hockey players, so I don't mean any disrespect when I say they're a product of a very good system. Everybody who goes into that system is the right player for that system of play. And they always seem to churn out guys left and right. And those guys are ultra talented. So I don't want to say that the system makes them, but at the same time, they are the right players to execute when they're playing well. Another couple of power play goals in each game this weekend, beating Harvard, beating Dartmouth, 11 goals on the weekend. That's what they do. And they limit shots on their own goal. They maximize their opportunities on offense. And that's really all you can ask for to go out and play the right system and get things right. I don't have the shot chart in front of me, but I'm willing to bet, they gave up 25 shots on goal to Harvard, and they gave up, I think it was 25 to Dartmouth or 27 to Dartmouth as I pull up the box score. I'm willing to bet all of those were from outside. I mean, the defense plays well, turns it into opportunities the other way. They score 3 goals in the second period against Dartmouth and then just keep rolling. So good to see Quinnipiac come back into getting into form, start rounding out into form. Now 5 wins in a row and starting to head on the road, too, for them with a couple of big matchups before they end in the Connecticut Ice Tournament. They're hitting their stride just in time to claim the state, it looks like, at the end of the month.
And Bob Gaudette at Dartmouth got his 1,000th game behind the bench with the win at Princeton on Friday. So congratulations to one of the great guys in college hockey, Bob Gaudette. Also, RPI, this is something they've rarely done. Rensselaer, Dave Smith's Engineers went to the North Country, never an easy place to travel to. 3-1 win over Clarkson, blanking of St. Lawrence. Finally, for St. Lawrence, the last game they're going to have to play at SUNY Canton at Rue's house. They'll get to go back to Appleton. Even though it's not still completely finished, at least they get to be back on home ice. But that was a good statement for RPI to win both those games up north. Granted, SLU on a down year, but to beat Clarkson, that's saying something.
Yeah, and for RPI, too, I don't think they've won at Clarkson for a while. I think you got to go back. I don't think anybody in their uniform right now has won at Clarkson. Actually, that's a lie. I think they won a few years ago. 3 years ago, they won at Clarkson. So it's a tough place to play. That train horn drives me nuts up there. But, for RPI to get 4 points on the road in the North Country, they get to come home now and smile. They're playing a little house money when they're going into Cornell. 3 wins in their last 4 games, dating back to the beginning of the month in December. So, it's a good showing for them, and it's good to see them get the wheels moving. 5-5-1 in conference, and if they come away with a split, then head out to Brown and Yale. All of a sudden, we're talking about RPI as a major factor in that mid tier of ECAC.
When we look out west to the WCHA, a couple of games we highlighted on last week's Game of the Week podcast included the series with Minnesota State hosting Alaska. Minnesota State swept that, no surprise there. But Bowling Green looking like they're in a little trouble right now. They have been plummeting down the pairwise and down the poll. They've lost 4 in a row, 3 of those in conference, 2 of those in overtime, including a 4-3 loss to Northern Michigan at Bowling Green on Saturday, a 5-2 loss on Friday. Only 1 goal and that was one of the 2 goals on Friday was even strength, the power play goal on Friday, and all 3 goals in the 4-3 overtime loss coming on the power play. And it was also a game in which Bowling Green handily outshot Northern Michigan, but that was enough to plummet the Falcons all the way now down to 23rd in the pairwise, which means you're in must-win-the-league area of things in the pairwise. I don't even know if they'll be able to climb their way back out of that, but fortunes have really changed for a Bowling Green team that looked like it had gotten full momentum towards the end of the semester.
Yeah, they were really good heading down the end of that semester. They split out up on Lake Superior, and that second game was an overtime loss. And I thought they were starting to turn the corner, and they were a team that I was watching in that WCHA again to fill in the not Minnesota State spot. But now 4 in a row, and this is problematic. Whenever you split a weekend, whatever happens the next weekend determines how you feel about the split. So you split with Lake Superior, and then you lose to Miami. You've lost 2 in a row. If you would come back and beat Miami, you all of a sudden now have won 5 out of 6 or whatever the number winds up being. So it's whatever you do coming out of a split that starts to determine things on if you can overlook the loss or if you're struggling. I think that's a blanket statement across all sports. You come out and you just get swept by Northern Michigan, though, and that is now 4 in a row. You're sliding, and now you have to go to the UP to play Michigan Tech this weekend. When you're done with that, you have to play Minnesota State, and that's before you even get a bye weekend. So when things are going poorly, if you can't pump the brakes, which is very hard to do, right? It's just not an easy thing to do. You're looking at potentially falling down to 500 overall, under 500 in the conference, with a trip left to Alaska up to Fairbanks later on this year. It gets really difficult, plus a road trip to Alabama down the end of the year. So for Bowling Green, you have to come up with a solution right now. Otherwise, things are going to start slipping back. And I think they're good enough to do that. I think they're good enough to come out. And I think they're going to surprise some people this weekend if you're a doubting person, if you're a doubting Thomas like me. But if you're not, if you're a believer, you may be very happy to see what happens, because I think this weekend, this is going to be a very, very good weekend against Michigan Tech of hockey that's up there on the Upper Peninsula.
One more thing to mention before we take a quick look at the PairWise. Boston College, a lopsided win over Vermont. Now 10 wins in a row for BC. The Eagles are back.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is... But I think it was a couple of weeks ago I said to you at some point, someone in that locker room probably looked around and said, yeah, we're not doing this again. We're not 3 years without the tournament. That's not happening again. And it's not. I mean, they're loaded. They're good. This is going to be fun. I can't wait for the Bean Pot this year, because it's, they'll play BU in the first round. And that's always a, battle, because it doesn't matter where they are in the standings. They'll play each other tough. But the possibility of when I say old school, go back a few years when BC was very good, Northeastern was very good. The possibility of the two of them playing each other at the Garden multiple times is real fun for me. Being in the area, like I said about North Dakota, things are more fun when North Dakota is really good. Things are really fun in Boston when you have BC as the big dog to go take a shot at, especially the last 10, 15 years. So they're good, and they're clicking. And if they keep this up, it's going to be really fun. And it starts this weekend, because I tell you, UMass does not want to have to hear about how Eastern Mass is back and Boston this and Boston that. Western Mass, there's going to be some pride in that. And so this weekend, switching from Connie Forum to the Mullins Center, it's going to be some real fun when you put a good streaking BC team into that mix.
Well, BC right now at number 5 in the PairWise. And why don't we hop on that quickly before we wrap? Things are bracketing fairly nicely numerically in the PairWise. Right now, I'm going to put some categories together. First category is solid for the postseason. Not as solid as it would be towards the end of January, beginning February. But right now, 5 teams are in that category, and there's sort of a cutoff in RPI between 5 and 6. So North Dakota, Cornell, Minnesota State, Denver, and Boston College. I wouldn't bet the house on it, but they are as close to a lock for the NCAA postseason as anybody at this point right now.
Yeah, and the one to watch is what happens between those teams, because someone's going to have to travel somewhere. So if you're Boston College and you're the 5 seed, you want to get into that 4 so you can try to get a series that's either so you can play in a place like Worcester, and you don't have to go to Albany, or you don't have to go to Allentown, Pennsylvania. Like, you'd like to be playing in Worcester. So if you can pass Denver, you get that. If you stay at the 5, you could be getting sent out to Colorado. You could still be playing in Worcester. You could be in Albany. You leave a lot less up to chance that way.
And as we talk, 20, 21, 22 wins is sort of where you need to get to. North Dakota already with 16, Minnesota State with 18. Cornell is going to have a hard time getting to 21 or 22 wins, but it's possible given that they only play 29 games. But right now, Cornell and North Dakota, at least in the RPI, have separated themselves pretty well. But let's look at the next category, and I'm going to call this the strong category. Normally, I would maybe cut this off at 10, but let's look at 11, because Northeastern and Minnesota Duluth are just the 4th decimal point apart. And the teams in this area got to keep doing what they've been doing. Penn State, Ohio State, UMass Lowell, Minnesota Duluth, and Northeastern. These are all teams that are strong for the postseason.
Yeah, and 4 of those teams still have to play each other a lot. UMass Lowell, Northeastern, Providence, they're all in that clump with BC of Hockey East. So those teams are all going to dictate what happens behind BC and maybe what happens even with the 2 seeds and the 3 seeds. And if you're a Notre Dame or you're a Clarkson, you want to see those teams cannibalize each other a little bit more than they have to this point, where they all have 4, 5, 6 losses. So somebody's going to have to drop out of that, and that's going to make for some really competitive hockey. And if anybody's able to catch an upper glimpse in there, so UMass plays well this weekend, Northeastern takes BC, for a run later on this year, Providence continues playing well, then you're looking at potentially one of those teams strengthening and one of the other teams not strengthening their case to get out, and some other team sneaking in.
The teams that are kind of borderline right now, and I'm going to let Northeastern straddle 2 categories. Northeastern at 11, then Providence, Clarkson, Notre Dame. Those teams would probably make it in if the season ended right now, but they've really got to watch things because they could just as easily fall a couple of spots and be out of it.
Well, you look down at the teams that are out, and you see Quinnipiac, and you see Harvard, and you see Army, and someone's going to have to get in from Atlantic Hockey. So someone's going to get in there, right? So if you're straddling the line and you're at 15, 16, 17, you got some work to do, and you can't lose. That's the most important thing. You can only hold your own against those teams that are underneath you, and then at this point, hope that someone slides from in front of you. If you're Michigan State and you're looking at Notre Dame, you're kind of playing against them, playing to the curve, but you really have to be careful because there are some teams that could very easily go out, win their conference, like Dartmouth, like Harvard, like even Bowling Green in the WCHA, and then you're sitting home and you're watching the tournament unfold on ESPN.
And right now, I think you're at the point where you're only going to see one Atlantic hockey team in the postseason. Army, had they picked up a win or even 2 wins in the Fortress Invitational, might have been able to move themselves up into the 12, 13, 14 area. It's going to be hard for Army to move up. Everybody else who has non-league games, you're talking mostly Arizona State. RIT's also got a pair with UMass Lowell. Even sweeping Lowell and Arizona State's not going to be enough to move them into the conversation. So you already got one team off the list. You got to be top 15 to get in, and probably 1 or 2 other leagues will have somebody move in there. But anybody who's on the bubble, anybody we talk about like Michigan Tech, Arizona State, Michigan State, Quinnipiac, Northern Michigan, Harvard, which looked like it was off to the races early on this season, has had a little bit of a stumble here at midseason. Those are all teams that are going to have to do very well in their leagues and may have to go a round or 2 in the postseason tournament in their conferences just to be able to get into that top 14, 15.
And even worse than that, you're going to have to start rooting and watching games outside your league just to see what's happening. And I'm not saying that from a coaching standpoint, because you always try to control the controllable there. But if you're a fan and you're watching your game between Michigan State and Notre Dame or Quinnipiac and Harvard, those games become huge games. But then you also need to watch the Michigan Tech Northern Michigan game, or you need to watch Providence Northeastern or Providence BU, and you have to watch those teams in those games and find your rooting interests to help you out to shore things up. But the most important thing is you also have to win your games in league. So it's going to be really exciting to watch from afar for me, namely because, like I said, Atlantic hockey is going to be a one-bid league this year, despite my best efforts to root Army through the Fortress Invitational. So for us to be able to watch it, we'll be able to watch it unfold. And I'm sure it's going to be carnage in the next month where all this stuff just starts breaking down.
Atlantic has had enough wins out of conference against some good teams that the Atlantic hockey postseason is going to have an impact on some pretty big teams. And I'm going to predict somebody who shouldn't have lost to an Atlantic hockey team and did is going to miss the tournament because of that.
Well, take case on Monday night, right? We're recording this on Monday. Northeastern's hosting Bentley. That's a game that Bentley has had success in. I'm not just saying that because, everyone knows about my relationship with Bentley. But Bentley has had success beating Northeastern in the past. If Northeastern loses that game, it becomes a quality win for Atlantic hockey. And somewhere down the line, Arizona State needs to watch themselves in that because, there's math and things that could work out in there. And Northeastern sitting at 11, they lose that game and they could tumble down and take a slide. So these are some really big games. I know people look at the schedule and say, well, it's a gloss over game against an Atlantic hockey team, but it really isn't, because Atlantic hockey can throw a wrench into this really quickly.
Well, as the song goes, the knee bone is connected to the thigh bone, and everything is all connected up for the postseason. But that's all we have time for with this week's Weekend Review podcast. Dan Rubin, it's been great to have you pinch hit again for Jim Conley. Our episode has been sponsored by the 2020 NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th in Detroit, Michigan. For tickets, visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. For Dan Rubin, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Weekend Review podcast, a production of U.S. College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.